Lots of provincial news over the past week and over the past several days. Actually, teachers are still striking. A judge has found some wrongdoing in a conflict of interest case at AHS, but says the premier and ministers didn't have anything to do with it specifically. Also, the province held municipal elections Monday. There were some surprises, though, and some blowouts. Here to comment further is legislative correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. For the last time, unfortunately, too. Tyler, welcome.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay, well, we're going to miss you for sure because this is your last hit with us. So let's make this a good one, shall we? There's obviously no shortage of big stories going on and to discuss. So, Tyler, Albertans went to the polls Monday for municipal elections, and by now most cities and towns know who their new mayors and council members will be for the next 4 years. And there were some surprises, though. So, Tyler, which cities had some of the biggest changes of council?
Well, the thing that really shocked people on Monday seems to have been how long it took to vote. You're probably by now people will have heard that there have been some major delays at the polling stations, and that there were sort of lineups around the block kind of thing, which is not something you really see very much. And that seems to have been because there were changes in the rules. You had to fill out a special form saying you were eligible to vote, which was new this year. And that was kind of a shock to some people. Now, in terms of like the actual election outcomes, what were shockers? I mean, I think one of the big takeaways, at least from the major cities, Edmonton and Calgary, is that the folks who are running for or on a party slate didn't actually win. The votes went to independent mayoral candidates. And you had the regular amount of churn between councillors and things like that. Incumbents reelected, some incumbents not reelected. So I don't think any major like electoral shocks to the system. Maybe Jody Gondek in Calgary, having lost her seat as mayor, was a bit of a shock to her. But the big shock seems to have been simply how the voting went on Monday.
I know the lines were long. I stood in line for over an hour. I know we interviewed some folks who were not very happy. Some people actually left because they were on their lunch break. So it was, there was a lot of, not happy people. And I know that there weren't a lot of polling stations either. I know here in Lethbridge, there were only 3 places to vote. I know I had heard similar things up in Edmonton where you are.
There were more than that for sure.
Obviously, much bigger city.
There were I think there were 70 or 80 individuals, like polls reporting. How many of those translate into actual physical spaces where people went to vote? I'm not too sure. But it didn't seem particularly crowded in my neighborhood. I was probably in and out in half an hour, but of course my name didn't show up on the registration when I went to go, so there was a bunch of extra work to be done. So I would have been out a lot faster had that not been the case.
Yeah, and I think the Canada strike or the Canada Post strike had something to do with that because nobody had their voter registration cards, which really delayed everything. So, okay, so there was one other change that affected this election cycle, and that was the addition of municipal political parties in Edmonton and Calgary. So what can you tell us about that, Tyler?
Yeah, so last year the province changed the rules to allow for municipal political parties. This is pretty rare in Canada. Vancouver has municipal political parties, as does Montreal, and now Edmonton and Calgary do as well. And the idea is that you would have a clearer version of sort of the ideological alignment of the people you were voting for. If they were part of a particular slate, you might conclude that they're more conservative. If they're part of another slate, you might conclude that they were more progressive. And that was sort of the intention behind the changes to the rules. And the province, the conservative politicians in the province have always been a bit stumped and annoyed by the fact that cities tend to elect progressive city councils, even as they're electing conservative members of parliament federally and conservative members of the legislative assembly provincially. So that's sort of what was going on with the decision making here. The thing that seems notable about it from Monday is that it doesn't seem to have made a massive difference. In both Edmonton and Calgary, independent candidates won. In Edmonton, I think there's about 4 councillors who are affiliated with a party slate, and they did win. And then in Calgary, I think that number was more like 7. There were more parties in Calgary than Edmonton. But all in all, this doesn't seem to have really shaken up the race. It doesn't really seem to have shaken up the outcome in some sort of meaningful sense. I mean, if you think about independents trying to run in other elections, they really have no luck. They don't get very many votes. It's really only the big parties. And so maybe that will shift over time as people become more used to the party system. There becomes a more clear affiliation with those parties and what they stand for. But the thing to watch for now is those people who are members of those parties, that slate of voters who are in city councils. How will that affect the dynamics down at City Hall? I think, are they going to be voting, with each other? Is there going to be any internal dispute, that sort of thing? So it could have some effect now that the election's done. But in terms of how things shook out on election day, I don't get the sense, anyways, that there was much impact of this voting thing. And I should also mention, if because we haven't brought it up yet, was the electronic tabulator thing that caused some controversy on Monday.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. What was that all about, Tyler?
Yeah, so this was part of the same rule changes as bringing in political parties. The province banned the use of electronic vote tabulators, which basically like a Scantron that you might remember from high school. Basically like that, it counts up the votes, and then you know the answer relatively quickly. The province banned them, and now all votes had to be counted by hand, which is why probably on Tuesday people were hitting refresh on their municipal government website to try and find out who the heck the mayor was. And that's because you had individuals, pulling ballots out of a box and counting them by hand. And that delayed things quite a bit. I believe Jeremy Farkas in Calgary, his victory, I think, was known on Monday evening, late Monday, or perhaps very early Tuesday. But the mayor of Edmonton wasn't really unofficially declared until I think about 2:00 in the afternoon on Tuesday, because they were counting all the ballots by hand. It just took a long time. So this was itself a controversial decision. Alberta municipalities opposed it. I know that Red Deer had said it was going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars more to run this election because of that rule change. So another little controversy and that did have some sort of real world impacts as we were waiting for results to come in on Monday night.
Yeah, exactly. I was one of those ones hitting refresh. And it's like, oh, this is not real time updates.
It's going pretty slow.
Yeah, it was kind of ridiculous. Do you remember the reason why the province changed that rule?
Yeah, so the province, it has to do with voter security fundamentally. There is this idea that electronic vote counting is less reliable than hand counting, and that's obviously a controversial position to hold. There are certainly people that believe that electronic voting is actually more accurate because it takes out the human error aspect of it. And you can always have a hand count afterwards if you need to confirm something, or if you've got a really, really close race, something like that. But the province basically said that this was a voter security thing, that it would make elections more secure, and therefore there would be more confidence in the democratic process. I think it's probably fair to say that's a debatable point, and that after waiting for 12 or almost 24 hours to find out results, some Albertans might feel differently about it.
Oh my gosh. All right, moving from municipal politics into provincial politics, the legislature will return Monday. The province promises an ambitious 15-bill agenda for the fall sitting. So what does it include, Tyler?
Yeah, so there's obviously a whole bunch of stuff, and there's sort of two that are going to, I think, get a lot of conversation. The first is another change to how elections happen, and that one's going to have to do with only sort of serious candidates are going to be allowed on the ballot. There's going to be a process put in place whereby you won't have joke candidates or protest candidates on the ballot. And people might remember when, this is a federal issue, not a provincial one that I'm about to talk about. People might remember when Pierre Poilievre ran in the by-election in August for a seat in Parliament. He was running in a rural Alberta riding, Battle River, Crowfoot, maybe. I'm completely blanking on the name of it, but it doesn't really matter. And it was a huge ballot. There were all these candidates, this longest ballot initiative, which is sort of designed to protest the first past the post electoral system. So it was just this massive ballot of people that electors had to look through to find the name of the candidate, probably for a major party who they wanted to vote for. And so the rules would, if the Alberta government changes those rules, it would prevent something like that happening in in a provincial election. But obviously going to be a little bit of controversy there if the government seemed to be gatekeeping, who can run for office in the province. The other thing that I think is going to be controversial, or at least interesting, is people might remember the Jordan Peterson case with the Ontario College of Psychologists, where he was sort of disciplined and ordered to go to sort of remedial social media training for comments he had made on social media, which did not have that much to do with his job as a psychologist. Now, the Alberta government is moving to change rules that says, and it will say basically that professional regulatory bodies will not be able to discipline members for things that are unrelated to their work. And of course, regulatory bodies do have that power currently. If you're a lawyer or a doctor, if you behave in a certain fashion outside, even outside of your office hours, you can be disciplined by the professional institute, basically for things like bringing disrepute to the profession, stuff like that. So the rules are going to change a little bit around the way that professional bodies will be able to regulate their members. We don't know exactly what that looks like. We don't know where those lines will be drawn, but that has been something that's sort of been percolating in conservative circles for more than a year, probably 2 years now. And the Alberta government is going to create some legislation around that.
Okay, my gosh. Okay, back to the province here. A big one for parents, for kids, for teachers. This is something that, the other thing that we should be watching for is back to work legislation to force teachers back into the classroom. Now, the UCP government asked striking teachers to go back to work late last week. They sent that work to rule letter asking them to return to the classroom October 20th, which was this past Monday. But the ATA said no because the government has remained inflexible in fixing those class sizes. So, Tyler, what would be the difference this time around if it did happen?
Well, teachers would more or less have to go back. If the government legislated a return to work, that sort of brings an end to the strike. It certainly won't bring an end to the negotiations about the new teacher contract, about all the issues that are still out there, but teachers will have to return to the classroom and do their jobs. Probably they would do that in a relatively limited fashion. They would not necessarily be doing extracurriculars like coaching teams, going to tournaments, putting on plays, things of that nature, unless they're forced to by the legislation. But it would bring an end to the strike, essentially, that will have gone on for about a month by that point. Now, of course, there is still 1-2 weekdays left. Possibly they negotiate over the weekend. It is possible we see an 11th hour deal, but judging from the way things have gone at this point, I would consider that fairly unlikely. But what that does mean is that probably at some point next week, teachers will be returning to the classroom and therefore students will be returning to the classroom. I think that's probably a fair prediction, but of course we don't know exactly how that would play out in the legislature and what happens after that. If there's, a bit of a runway before things get up and running again, a bit hard to say on that. But the Coles Notes version of it is the government is telegraphing that they're going to legislate an end to the strike here.
Interesting. Okay. Switching gears here. Late last week, the province released a judge's final report into what the opposition has labeled CorruptCare. So these are these allegations of corruption and conflicts of interest when it came to health contracts in the province. So they were investigated by a former Manitoba chief judge, and he found no evidence of wrongdoing by Premier Danielle Smith or any minister or political staff member. However, his report stated that he did find conflict of interest by 2 staffers. So, Tyler, can you maybe dive into this a little bit more?
Yeah, this is a really complicated one that goes back to the firing of the Alberta Health Services CEO and a subsequent wrongful dismissal lawsuit and all sorts of allegations made in documents. There's been all sorts of reporting done on some of the behind the scenes stuff going on here. So it's a real complicated topic. The gist of it, though, is that you had these 2 cases. You had the purchase of children's Tylenol medication, which came up during this big sort of worldwide Tylenol shortage, and you had contracts given out for private surgical care in the province. What the judge found is that there was no wrongdoing in either of these cases by the premier or cabinet or political staff. What they found, however, was that these 2 staffers that you mentioned, there were conflict of interest in procurement rules within Alberta Health and within Alberta Health Services, and those were not necessarily followed during the awarding of the contracts for the Tylenol and the private surgical centers. So this report is also a little bit limited. And the reason it's limited is because it was not sort of a public inquiry. The judge could not compel testimony. There were a number of people who did not speak to the judge. They did not have to answer every question that he put to them. They're obviously answering through lawyers and things like that. So it does reach this conclusion. But the judge himself says in the report that he was not able to interview various people. So it's perhaps an incomplete picture of what happened. Now, we might get more information from this because there's simultaneously an RCMP investigation that's probably going on into this. And there's also the Alberta's Office of the Auditor General is looking into it as well. So that's all what's going on there. Probably we're going to not, we haven't heard the end of this, is basically what I'm saying. The court case is still ongoing over wrongful dismissal. There are these other investigations going on as well that we'll hear more about in the weeks and months to come. But certainly the government is looking at this as an exoneration to some extent at sort of this point into what happened in all of this.
Yeah. Do we know what's going to happen with those two staffers? It sounds like the senior officials didn't do anything to reprimand them or anything.
Yeah, no, we don't know what happens to them. And they were in sort of interesting positions because they'd had consultancy roles and were with the government and then not with the government and stuff like that. So it's all a bit of a mess. And I have not seen anything yet that indicates what's going to happen to those two people.
Yeah. Didn't his report also point out that roughly $50 million is still outstanding from those contracts? What happens with that?
Yeah, another good question and another open question that I don't think we have a super clear answer to.
Right.
Because we only got a portion of the Tylenol delivered, I believe, as well. So as is probably obvious from our back and forth on this, it's a very messy, confusing situation without perhaps as many clear answers as people would like.
All right. It looks like we're out of time here. I still had so many questions for you, Tyler, but it's been a pleasure working with you over the past several years that I've had the opportunity to interview you. So thank you so much, and the best of luck to you in your future there, Tyler. We will miss you for sure.
Thanks so much. It's been a wonderful time, and I will miss getting to blabber away at all your viewers every couple weeks.
Awesome. Tyler Dawson, the legislative correspondent with the National Post. Thanks so much for joining us today.